Hey, I do not see the join the panel.
We are live now. So so now we will enter into our second technical session of the today, which is on automating provisioning and deprovisioning with identity life cycle management. And to present this topic, may I now request to introduce our second speaker of the day, Mr. Nagesh Gummadivalli, who is identity governance and risk partner at Netflix. He is a leader in security, identity, and access management area with more than 20 years of experience in information security, data privacy, security audit, governance, and risk management. He has extensive strategic consulting and implementation experience in identity and access management, governance, and risk management. Nagesh led strategic identity management initiative for financial technology companies, to name a few, like Capital One, Vanguard, and JP Morgan, and has recently joined Netflix. Over to you, Nagesh.
Thank you, Nira. And good morning, everyone. This is Nagesh Gummadivalli, and I'm really excited to talk about some of the guidelines and principles around identity lifecycle management, especially provisioning the human identities. So the topic is really focusing on the human identities, and we'll come back to the machine in the next session. So let me know if you guys can see my screen. If thumbs up would be great, if anyone. But all right, thank you. Right. Okay. So what I want everyone to take away today is, I'm believing the crux of the intent at the start of the presentation is to building an intelligent automation for identity lifecycle. So when I say build an automation, that's your part of key strategy in your identity governance, which dramatically improves your security posture of the company. So we'll talk about some of the complementing capabilities to improve the identity lifecycle while talking about traditional joiner, mover, lever, termination use cases. I will leave a lot of room for questions and hoping this to be more interactive session rather than just dumping the enormous amount of identity lifecycle discussions. So what is exactly the problem we are talking about? Any organization with 1,000 users typically uses more than 300 applications on top of the databases, on top of the cloud resources, network resources, and each one of them have different permission model. And as soon as you're bringing the different permission model, the complexity of building an identity to access permissions to those varying permission model becomes very complex. On the other hand, when you really look at identity access management, fundamentally it covers 3 points, right? One is who has access to what? That's the crux of identity access management. And looking at, is this access is really required to perform this job? And is this access is actually being monitored, logged, reported, and for any user behavior analytics on top of that. So that's the essence of IAM. We are doing it. And success of identity access management here really not only managing the identities, rather you manage the identity access to the systems. And that is where you're really, the outcome of business outcome is coming out with IAM investment. And building all of this is naturally, on paper, it looks very simple, saying that is very simple, but building this system is one of the complex technological problem you have seen from last 20 years, and we are still improving it, but there are more challenges with coming up. Little bit of more context on the problem again. Based on the identity defined security alliance report, more than 70% of breaches today are happening due to identity related problems. It could be a compromised credentials, it could be your privileged account. And when I say privileged account, the privileged actually creates two separate problems. One is the user, the insider risk, where the user is accessing a system in an unauthorized way, and that thus creating the data loss with that. Or if an intruder was able to get your credentials, which has the privileges which are always on, also creating that extra backdoor for data loss. That's the other problem there. So what is the solution really talking about is we're not talking about the least privilege here, rather you're talking about principles of right privilege. When you're talking about the right privilege, when an end user is asking for extra access using a support ticket, on an average, you're spending $110 for every support ticket you're talking about. So from identity governance and from identity lifecycle management, it is essentially the business value if you can build a policy where you are providing that default access to the users as and when needed, rather than creating that manual task. So that is when you're talking about the automation, so that you are taking all of the incoming requests in the right way, you're auditing it, you're approving, you're capturing the approval information, so that it is more sustainable compliance and reduce the need for after remediation. Again, so let's really go back to our foundational concept in identity lifecycle management. I did not draw a lot of architectural diagrams just to avoid the clutter, just assuming that you have your authoritative systems such as your Workday, HCM, CRM, the other system of regard. And once you detect a new lifecycle event, which can be your joiner, mover, or leaver, then your identity lifecycle kicks in. And that is where you started doing the provisioning. That means as soon as a new employee joins, on day one, you would like to provision the user's access on what they need. That improves the user satisfaction, also improves the productivity for the company. And also when the user moves from one job to the other job, the internal transfer. Today, if you're not really having any identity lifecycle, the problem is the access creep happens because the users start accumulating more access, and thus that leading to the escalation of privileges where they can do the insider race, or as I said, the intruder can gain their access and also can do the data loss there. So the mover, when the move happens internally, you would like to have workflow orchestration to take care of that mover lifecycle, where you remove the extra permissions and grant new permissions as and when needed. So that is also avoids the permissions problem. And the third most important use case in this whole joiner, mover, and leaver is really talking about when the employee is terminated. There are some situations where you still need to have a legal hold to leave the user's access, the stamp of that identity. But essentially, you would like to make sure that user is disabled, user's access is removed in every other use cases. So in that case, users are leaving without privileges of the old systems. And that is also an important attribute for your compliance and auditing reasons. If you talk about any SOX, CCPA, GDPR regulations, you need to make sure that users, upon terminations, users are losing their access. We can talk about that. And also you'll have the internal ISO audit controls where you would like to make sure the users are not having access to the critical systems without a proper approval chain. Any questions? Feel free to jump in, raise the questions, anything that. So once, as we said, right, once you talk about your Workday authoritative systems, you build your connector or your buy the product, irrespective of that. Once you detect that identity lifecycle management, implement the joiner, mover, leaver use cases, your foundations are strong. I think that at least you're covering the base now. And how do you really expand to the next level? And that is where you're talking about if an end user wants to have access to an application, because the new applications are being created always, you would like to have a centralized access request system. So the end user has a one place to come, place the request for the new application, and it goes to the right approval chain if needed. typically I would not recommend a new approval systems for low risk entitlements, just to improve the productivity, but approval chain is required for any critical systems for SOX and other PCI related regulations. So that also try to avoid as much as you can on help desk, manual help desk tickets. Try to avoid extra Google Groups creation form. Try to avoid all of that unnecessary ad hoc access request mechanisms, rather club all of that into your centralized access request. That is one of the most critical success factor for improving the productivity. Also, you can improve the security by enforcing the consistency policy, right? You can put your controls on the saying that if the user is asking XYZ, and if that is a critical system, and if you have a right policy, that you can deny or approve, and you can have that consistency by having the centralized access request system. The same thing, right? You would like to improve the policy management there. You would like to have your company's centralized policies, how to do the segregation of duties, or any other policies based on your compliance and governance rules. You can enforce that having a single repository or single place for placing the request. So as I said, your step 0 is to really build the capabilities from joiner, mover, lever use cases. And step 2 is really building the access request as a centralized. And once you have that data repositories, once you start collecting this information, now you can expand that into the next level. Here, you are going to do the access modeling. So in access modeling, what does it mean is you will start seeing that, hey, what is this cluster of access? If XYZ user and ABC users are talking to the same permissions, if you're talking about same entitlements, can I abstract that, put into a role? That is where the previous speaker is talking about your role-based authorization or RBAC. You can do the ABAC and RBAC, but you start talking about the abstraction of those permissions so that you can create a role. Then you will have more intelligence saying that if these two users are accessing the same level of permissions, can I grant these users access at the time of the birthright or default access? So that is actually improving your productivity at the same time. So you are going to do that role mining. You are going to capture the cluster of access. Then you're going to build the peer groups based on that usage pattern. Then that is what your identity warehouse that is going to provide a lot more intelligence for your automation. And that can happen in the background, meaning you don't have to really ask end users to go and place the request explicitly for this initiative. You can collect the data as on when the users are submitting the request, when your system is removing it based on their mover or other use cases, then you're really start building those recommended systems on top of that. Now, once I have, this is your step 2, step 3, you're getting into much more maturity level at this point of time. Then some people like to have access to some systems, and if they are not entitled to have the access to the system, the critical system, you can start building the recommender. You can start building the risk score for that data classification and the identity. You can combine that intelligence saying that the ABC user has access to XYZ. Is that really the need for here? So you start putting that risk score as an extra variable for your resource owner, and the resource owner can make that change, saying that, you know what, this user has access to it, this user never accessed it. Should I leave always on access for this user, or should I just remove it? So you're giving a little bit of more context for the approvers, context for the resource owners, as well as context for your compliance team. And that can happen only once you start collecting all of the step 2, step 3, the access patterns in the previous stuff. Now, as I said, once you start building your intelligence, you will start talking about your data classification by integrating with your ServiceNow or any asset inventory. If there is a low risk entitlement, the end user is asking for it, you can actually do the auto provisioning of that. So it is really dynamic in nature. You are doing that just in time provisioning for that end user instead of asking for the approval chain, instead of wasting the end user's time and the owner's time. And that is your really recommendation system, which can really improve overall access request, access placement, and the productivity. Um, once you have this, end of the day, you're still supporting and serving the compliance and auditing reasons, and that is where you start building your segregation of duties. Segregation of duties essence is to maintain the compliance where I typical example is I'm not the one requesting and approving by myself. That is where you bring the conflict of interest. You can apply your policies with that, saying that who can place the request for what kind of roles, who can approve those requests from what kind of for what kind of requesters. You can build all of the segregation of duties, which is pretty critical in healthcare and financial based on my past experience, extensively used in the industry. And also, if at all if there isn't for end users to have access to XYZ system for a change management reason, you can still provision that user's access, but also can alert for your compliance and auditing reasons. So you'll have more business justification, and also that prevents your fraud and data loss. All right, so this is generally my recommendation to go from any identity lifecycle management from building perspective. But as I said, this is pretty easy to say it, but in reality, it's pretty hard. How do you really scale these connectors? How do you really build the connectors to target systems? My recommendation is, if you are using the vendor product, there are many vendors who have access or built the connectors to hundreds of target systems. Work with your architecture team and say that if anybody is building a new application in the company, make it as a SCIM 2.0 compliant, so that as soon as your application, the target application, is using the 2.0 compliancy, you can have your SCIM connector less than coffee time, so that you have the consistent connector and you can scale it much faster, but also it's very consistent. For your legacy applications, though, that modernization is very critical. And if the business is not able to do that modernization, make it as a SCIM 2.0 compliant, you go back and work with your REST API and other native connector type mechanisms to build that connector to those applications. Again, this is all we're talking about your role-based authorizations, human identity lifecycle, typically coarse-grained. How do I get into a state where I would like to have a fine-grained authorization rather than the coarse? And that is where you bring your PBAC, that is called policy-based authorization, or you bring your ABAC, attribute-based access controls. So with the combination of your coarse-grained, any identity governance product, and the combination of your PBAC and ABAC model, you can really achieve a coarse-grained as well as a fine-grained authorizations. And don't go too harsh on the fine grain to begin with. Start very slow. Pick only a few systems where they are very critical, and then slowly expand that. Don't start that as a target architecture on the day one. Rather, pick death by 1,000 cuts is the way to say that. Pick few systems to implement your PBAC and ABAC and start improvising it much higher. And also make sure that when you are doing the PBAC and ABAC, if you are building a vendor product, make sure they have a policy simulation point, so that when you're touching a policy, make sure that who are the end users being impacted with the policy. That's a differentiator in your decision, because that is what you're going to use in production heavily. And again, the micro certification and ad hoc certification that comes under identity governance, typically not necessarily from the identity lifecycle, but you can argue on both ways, where you have to renew or attest the user's access. That is where you do the certification. However, the industry is changing now. The efficacy of the certification is fading away, really, because once the manager is seeing 2000 entitlements and end user, they have no idea that what are those entitlements, and those entitlements descriptions are missing. There it is becoming a rubber stamping rather than really a due diligence aspect of it. So the recommendation I have here is you do the certification for only highest critical applications, which are SOX and PCI or HIPAA, whatever those applications you're talking about, the crown jewel applications. And for rest of them, really have a micro certification or ad hoc certification, meaning you don't trigger the certification for every entitlement the user has. That actually burns out your managers, burns out your app owners. It is not really a huge value at the end of the day for business. If you start seeing any anomaly in the user's access, that's where you trigger your ad hoc certification. So use the certification and a little bit of more detection, more on the monitoring aspect of it, rather than the stamping aspect of it. So that's basically my recommendations from starting from ground zero to ground five. Again, we can talk about the zero trust, the mission identities. They're all really outside of the scope of these presentations, but I'm happy to chat about those as well if there are any questions. So that's the end of this. Any questions?
Yeah, hey, thank you for giving such a valuable insights. I can see there are 3 questions. We will be taking it one by one. The first two are asked by Ghani. First question is, what will be a secure, scalable, and frictionless mover workflow in your experience?
That's definitely a loaded question. To be honest, right? The reality, as I said, hey, implement your workflow for Mover as soon as there is a change in your workday, the job title or the job business unit, you trigger, you revoke the old access, grant the new access. But in reality, that user might be supporting some of the old functionality too. So how do you really balance it out? There are two ways I see success in my case is you, as soon as you detect the mover change, you definitely trigger the workflow orchestration. In that orchestration, you keep certain access by asking the end user, asking the resource owner, saying that this user would like to have keep access for next 30 days or 60 days. So you will have that workflow initiated, your resource owner as well as you by yourself attesting that you need access for XYZ for some time, and you will gain new access. So you're definitely reducing the blast radius, but also you're aware that the user has the previous access for X amount of time, 30 days or 60 days. Then you come back and trigger one more time-based workflow after 30 days, saying that you got this access from your previous job, you're no longer needed. If you need it, you trigger a micro certification on top of that. So that's kind of a frictionless, so that user is not losing their access quickly, placing the request again, going through the approval chain or not. I think that's, you have to trust your internal employees, and that's probably the much better way to handle it in a frictionless experience. I hope that I answered the question, but feel free if it is not.
Yeah. Second question is, in your experience, what is the best way to deal with reorg when you have automated identity lifecycle starting from the HR system up to the target system?
Right. So the reorg, if we are doing again, if it is, there are two types of reorgs. You're talking about a mass department change that can trigger the transfer workflows, but work with your HR ahead of the time, saying that is this a genuine reorg with respect to the access chain, or is it just a business unit change where the users will still have the same level of access? If it is same level of access, do not even trigger a mover on that, because it's unnecessary change. But if there's a genuine access change, um, time it in such a way that you plan the whole workflows in a queue notification, topic notification, if you are aware of that, so that you are making sure that each individual request is its own workflow rather than as a bulk. So you take the whole bulk changes, like 1,000 employees are being impacted, you create a small 1,000 workflows, sub-workflows, so that each workflow has its own autonomous aspect of it. So that's probably the best way to handle that. Yeah, I see the third question too. Can we monitor the login and logout information in provisioning and deprovisioning? Absolutely. So when I was talking about building the user behavior analytics and anomalies, you work with your IDP logs, which is nothing but your ping federate, Okta, whatever the ping federate logs. You make sure that you have that integration. Not many vendor products do that very well, but we built our own products to look at what is the usage pattern from end users. When are they hitting your single sign-on? When are they logging out for those applications? We collect all of that log, then we build the access patterns on top of that. That gives you only the coarse grain though, because you will have the log only at when the user is logging and log out. You're not getting that information, what is that user is doing inside that application at the moment. And that is where you actually work with application owners to dump the logs in a appropriate way, so that you can actually correlate all of this using your ETL and data analytics tools.
Okay, thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Nagesh, for giving such valuable insights, and thank you for answering questions with a good explanation. So now we will be ending the session and we'll be moving on to the other topic. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks, man.